Welcome to the Objective Doula. I'm Terry Nova Anderson from HarmonyDoulaTraining.com. Identifying and navigating through our bias is an uncomfortable but necessary step for doulas. In the birth and postpartum space, where emotions can run high and decision fatigue and fear-based decision making can be common, recognizing when our own brains are playing tricks on us is critical and will help us to ground our support in objective evidence. Here are our learning objectives. By the end of this session, you should be able to identify 3 common cognitive biases that affect doula-client interactions. Distinguish between the different levels of evidence, anecdote versus systematic review. Translate complex research findings, or at least start to, like absolute versus relative risk, into more client-friendly language. And implement a neutral support protocol to ensure client autonomy regardless of our own personal beliefs. All right, let's get started. We all have a birth philosophy and a postpartum philosophy. Maybe you're the trust the process guru. Maybe you're the give me the epidural and a nap advocate. That philosophy is your North Star. But in the birth space and the postpartum space, it can also be a blindfold. Today, we're talking about a few of our biases that might deeply impact our client's experience. Some of these biases are our brain's tendency to search for, favor, and recall information that confirms what we already believe. For example, if you strongly believe home births are always safer, your brain will highlight every success story and dismiss every complication as an outlier. But our job isn't to be right. Our job is to make sure the client has enough information to help them make whatever choices feel right to them. To do that, we have to understand the hierarchy of evidence. The first part of this session might be uncomfortable. For a while, we're going to stop looking at the medical system and start looking into the mirror. To be a truly client-centered doula, you have to accept that your brain is a shortcut, loving machine that prefers being right over being objective. Here is a deep dive into how your brain is lying to you. Most doulas enter the profession because of a specific passion, maybe a transformative birth experience or a desire to fix a broken system. Well, beautiful, that passion creates an echo chamber. If you follow natural birth accounts on social media, the algorithms will fill your account to fit that model. They'll give you warm fuzzies. They might even hit you with some rage bait for when more managed birth goes bad. Your feed may never show you a positive story about a scheduled cesarean surgical delivery. It's unlikely to provide any sort of balanced view. You might also have training bias. Your trainers, even me, we have our own biases. Have you ever heard that the medical model of birth is to intervene before something has a chance to happen? And the midwifery model is to watch, wait, and intervene only on the rare occasion that intervention is needed? Think on this for a second. Do you perceive any bias in those statements? And if so, where is it directed? The result of listening to the echo chamber and our training is that we can reinforce what we already think we know. We begin to believe our bubble represents the universal reality of birth and postpartum for everyone. There are 3 cognitive shortcuts that frequently derail doula support. One is confirmation bias. This filter is the tendency to search for, favor, and recall information that confirms what we already believe. For example, if you believe rupturing membranes at 4 centimeters always leads to a cascade of other interventions, you will notice every time a client gets Pitocin and then a vacuum-assisted delivery. But you will forget the 3 clients who had membranes ruptured and still had a smooth vaginal delivery. Or let's imagine your birth lens, because we all have one. That's the sum of your training, your own client experiences, maybe your experiences, the stories you've heard. Now, imagine that your lens is tinted blue. You walk into a hospital and everything looks blue. You see a monitor, it looks blue. You see a nurse, you see a blue hue. You see an IV pole, it's blue. You might think, wow, this hospital's really blue. But the hospital isn't blue, your lens is. Confirmation bias is that blue tint. If you go into a birth thinking doctors always rush the pushing stage, you'll find evidence in that in every room. You'll see a doctor checking their watch and think, ah, they're rushing, when they might just be checking the time for their notes. To be a high level professional, you have to learn to take the glasses off. You have to ask yourself, what am I seeing? What is actually happening? Or am I seeing what I expected to see? Next, we have the availability heuristic. You could call this one the scary story effect. It involves judging the probability of an event simply based on how easily that example comes to mind. For example, if you once supported a client who had a very difficult birth experience with a certain OB, now every time a new client mentions that OB, your brain screams danger, even if that doctor otherwise has a really high satisfaction rate from their clients. You might be basing your evidence on one vivid memory. I know some of you are thinking about that one time with that doctor now. So take a deep breath in, grab all that tension you might be feeling in your body into a little bubble. And as you exhale that out, you don't have to carry it. It was a one-off. Next up in our cognitive shortcuts is the Dunning-Kruger effect, or the expert trap. This is a cognitive bias in which folks with a limited knowledge in a subject overestimate what they know. For example, have you ever read an article or a news study and excitedly told everybody about this thing that you feel as though you now know everything about, only to later find out people have been writing about this or studying it for a very long time, decades even, perhaps with very different results? A doula who finds themselves stuck in the Dunning-Kruger effect might end up policing the birth room or the postpartum space rather than supporting their client. One of the joys and a sorrow of getting my PhD was the constant discovering that the more I knew, the more aware I became of how much more there was to know and to learn. One of the things I love teaching freshmen is that they're so excited. Everything is so new. They talk, 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 and then get to the sophomores and they're not saying anything. And the juniors are a little bit more cautious. And then sometimes those seniors are coming back in with some Dunning-Kruger. The most dangerous cognitive bias, though, might be the third one here, the savior complex. This is where a person feels a compulsive, sometimes excessive, need to save, fix, protect, or rescue others, frequently sacrificing their own well-being in the process. Sometimes it involves believing only they have the power to do this thing. They might ignore that the person who hired them didn't ask for that kind of help. It might change the energy in the room. It might create tension and interfere with your client's birth or postpartum experience. The problem when a doula acts as the savior is that we take away the power from our client. Savior complex shifts the goal from supporting to controlling, and then we as the doula become just another person telling our clients what to do and how to do it. And they're trying to please us instead of having the experience that they're wanting. All right, now let's move from the internal mindset to the external evidence and working to become a little bit more research literate. In the doula world, evidence-based is sometimes used as a marketing buzzword, but true research literacy is about understanding limitations of a study as much as its findings. Let's start with the most common mistake folks make in assuming that because two things happen together, one caused the other. This is correlation versus causation. And you've probably heard the phrase correlation without causation. For example, let's think about epidurals and cesareans. The correlation, people who get epidurals before established labor have higher cesarean surgical delivery rates. The confounder, though, we wonder, or we should wonder, about why the client got an epidural before established labor in the first place. Was it because early labor was already dysfunctional and long, maybe painful? Maybe they haven't slept in 3 days. Maybe it was because the baby was positioned in a way to cause a lot of back pain, or had difficulty fitting into the pelvic inlet or mid pelvis or the outlet. Maybe it was an induction that had a lot of contractions, but not much change. In fact, the reason they needed the epidural could be the same as the reason they ended up with the surgical delivery. The epidural didn't necessarily cause the surgery. The difficult labor caused both. Another example for postpartum doulas could be bed sharing and uh, and SIDS, or sudden unexpected infant death. The correlation is many cases of SUID occur in adult beds. The nuance is that research shows us when we remove hazardous circumstances that are known to increase risk, like smoking, alcohol and drug use, falling asleep together on a sofa, and for body fed or chest fed, breastfed babies, the risk of sharing a sleep space drops significantly. The hazard is the cause, not the bed itself. Not all information is created equal. Maybe your client says that they read Pitocin increases the risk of postpartum mood and anxiety disorder. Or they say that red raspberry leaf tea will induce labor. We need to know where that information sits in a hierarchy of reliability. We often hear people quote a single study. For example, this one study said eating dates makes labor go faster. But as a doula, we want to know the entire body of evidence, what that says, so that you can support your client's confidence. At the bottom of our hierarchy of evidence is the anecdotal evidence. That's a personal experience. I call that the N of one. There's one person in that study. It's their personal experience. It's not a study at all. Or it's just somebody saying so, like that influencer on Instagram who might have no research to back up what they're saying at all. This has the lowest level of reliability. It's great for quick attention grabbers. It gets those views, it gets shared, but it's really terrible for clinical decision making, right? Above that, we have the expert opinion on a case report. This is observational, maybe, of one instance with some of their best guesses as to what happened, and then a recommendation for further study. Reliability on this is still low. It's one person's experience or professional's best guess, and it's not a basis for medical advice. We actually saw that really change the birth space over one case report around placentas and encapsulation and group B strap. Changed a lot of things, but it was just one observation. Moving up on the list with some moderate reliability is observational cohorts or case-controlled studies. Some key characteristics of cohort studies are that the participants share a common characteristic like age, their profession, their location, or exposure to a particular risk vector. Unlike experiments, researchers will observe rather than intervene in the lives of the participants in these kinds of studies. They can be retrospective, and so in a retrospective cohort study, what we do is we look back over the historical data and then identify exposures and outcomes that have already occurred. These studies tend to be time focused, but they can last for years and track developmental outcomes prospectively, looking into the future where participants are enrolled before the disease or outcome occurs and then followed in time. And because exposure is recorded before the outcome, these are stronger for determining cause and effect relationships. Some of the advantages here, they can be great studying rare exposure, identifying multiple outcomes from a singular exposure, and then calculating incidence rates. Some of the disadvantages, though, is they can be expensive, they're time consuming, they require large sample sizes, and they are also prone to participant dropout. So we might start with a large cohort and end up with a small one. And then there's the randomized controlled trials. These have a high reliability rate. They compare a treatment group to a control group and isolate a cause. These are good for comparing specific interventions. All the way at the top are systematic reviews and meta-analyses. This has the highest reliability. At the top of this hierarchy, you might find like the gold standard is the Cochrane Review Database. That's publicly available online. You can search it for keywords. It's a good resource for doulas, especially those of us who don't have access to research libraries to check on the most recent publications and journals. But a systematic review isn't just a literature review where the author picks their favorite articles. It's a highly organized, transparent process designed to answer specific clinical questions, like does continuous labor support reduce cesarean delivery rates? It's a quality filter. So researchers will look at every database, maybe in every language, if they're able to find all the single studies ever done on that topic. They'll then appraise those and throw out the ones that are poorly designed or obviously biased. And then they'll offer like a comprehensive report that says, we looked at 50 studies on this topic. Here's what we found overall. And then sometimes a systematic review turns into a meta-analysis. That's where we get the statistical part. So imagine like 5 different small studies on water birth. None of them had enough participants to be statistically significant on their own, not enough people in the cohort. But a meta-analysis can take that raw data from the 5, and if they share kind of similar parameters of study, they can pull that into one giant super study and then run the numbers again. The goal is to give a single, more accurate number, like the effect size. And when we're using those, that is usually considered like the highest level of evidence available. So let's compare a little bit. So if we have a single study, the scope is just one group of people in one place. Reliability here, that whatever was the outcome, that could just be a fluke. It could be influenced by bias. It could be useful for just generating some new ideas or thoughts on a topic. But a systematic review is going to look at hopefully thousands of people across the world, a very broad lens. Reliability, it's been designed to filter out bias and to get rid of those flukes. And so they're better for seeing trends in a large population base. Lastly, in our research literacy, we want the reminder that we have to go beyond reading the abstract. But that's not always easy. As I just mentioned, like paywalls can make things less accessible to readers and independent researchers who don't have access to university libraries and the subscriptions that they might have to journals. Here's a tip. If you're a college alumni, check and see if your institution offers an alumni library card. It might have limits, like you have to be on campus to utilize their journal database, but you might also get access remotely. Or you could reach out to an author and see if they'll give you a complimentary copy. That sometimes it takes a bit to get a response, but it does work pretty well. If we can look beyond the abstract, which is what, most people are actually, they're only just reading the abstract. If we can get comfortable looking into the methodology of the researchers, if we can look at the results section, we might also find there some red flags around their bias or flukes or other problems in their study. Like, was the study done with 20 people or 20,000 people? Did they start with a pool of 40,000 people, but then narrow it down to just 4,000? Did the study only have an N of 15, as in 15 participants? That's a pilot, not a proof. Maybe we want to look at the funding source. A study on the safety of a new formula that was paid for by the formula company itself isn't necessarily wrong, but it does require some extra scrutiny. It's important for doulas to also know the difference between absolute risk and relative risk. Relative risk is sometimes used as a flashy headline, while absolute risk is the actual story. And if you don't understand the difference, you might accidentally scare a client or yourself into a decision that's based on a huge percentage that represents a tiny reality. Or inadvertently encourage a client to dismiss a care provider's significant concern based on that client's own individual and perhaps unique risk factors. The absolute risk, or the AR, are kind of what we could use as the what are my odds number. Right? It can tell us the baseline probability of an event happening in a specific group of people. For example, 2 out of 100 people experiences a specific complication. The absolute risk here is 2%. The relative risk, or the RR, is a comparison number. It tells you how much the risk increases or decreases in one group compared to another. It's a ratio. So for example, if group A has a 2% risk and group B has a 4% risk, group B has 100% higher risk relatively. It's doubling, right? The 2 is going to a 4. It's doubling. The reason relative risk is so tricky is that it looks the same regardless of how big or small the actual numbers are. And this is why headlines use it. It's dramatic. So let's take a moment and look at the magnification effects. Let's consider these 2 scenarios where the studies claim that an intervention doubles the risk of a complication, 100% increase in relative risk. So in scenario A, which has a high baseline, only 100 people, we see 20 people, or 20% of the population, have an outcome. With this new intervention introduced, 40% of people, or 40 in 100, have that outcome. So yeah, that's a big deal. An extra 20 people out of 100 are affected. But in our low baseline scenario, we have 1 in 10,000 people. It's still doubling. It's still 100% increase in relative risk, but now it's 2 in 10,000. That introduction only added 1 extra person in the 10,000 people affected. Without knowing the baseline, 100% increase can be intentionally misleading, that magnification effect. Another thing we want to be careful about when talking to our clients is to let the math allow them to use their own internal risk meter decision maker. Right? We don't want to say it's fine, don't worry. That would be dismissive bias. And we also don't want to say it's dangerous, do this thing. That's fear-based bias. It's not the numbers. So let's look at a common scenario here. A care provider recommending induction for a baby that looks big on ultrasound. So our relative risk headline attention grabber would be, giving birth to large babies triples the risk of shoulder dystocia. The absolute risk is more the reality. The risk of shoulder dystocia might go from 0.5% in a general population to 1.5% in the population of large babies. That's tripling. An objective provider should provide a baseline. They should not just say that the risk tripled, they should also say that 1.5% or fewer than 2 in 100 babies will experience a shoulder dystocia. And that the client has a 98.5% chance of their baby's shoulders passing through without any issue. Here's a couple other commonly discussed stats in the birth space. Let's look at epidurals. The headline, epidurals make you 50% more likely to need a vacuum-assisted delivery. The reality, while relative risk is 50% higher, the absolute risk only moves 4 percentage points. So for 88 people out of 100, the epidural does not lead to instrument delivery. So there's nuance there, right? People might choose epidurals also because the labor was long and exhausting, which in itself is a risk factor for assisted delivery. Some of you might be familiar with the ARRIVE trial, elective induction at 39 weeks. The headline, induction prevents cesarean delivery, or induction is a 16% improvement. The reality is that the absolute difference was only 3.6%, and you'd need 28 people to be induced in order to prevent one cesarean delivery. So that's a number needed to treat equal to 28, which is another number that might be useful to know. The nuance is that for 27 people, the induction didn't change the outcome of their delivery method, but it did change their birth experience and their timeline. Lastly, we have continual fetal monitoring versus intermittent auscultation. The headline, monitoring increases cesarean section delivery by 60%. This was actually just a headline in the New York Times. The reality, this is one of the most significant relative risks in birth work. The Cochrane review showed that for every 100 people monitored continuously, about 6 extra people will have a cesarean surgical delivery compared to those who are monitored intermittently, often without corresponding improvements in baby outcome, like neonatal seizure. And the nuance, this is a place where evidence-based practice and hospital policy often clash, making it a bigger challenge for doulas to navigate. In summary, what I want you to take away here is when you see a statistic that says a risk doubles or increases by 50%, that's called relative risk. It's like saying a sale is 50% off, but you don't know if you're saving $5 or $500 until you know the original price. The original price is the absolute risk. For example, if your risk of a certain complication is 1 in 1,000 and it doubles, it becomes 2 in 1,000. For most people, a 998 in 1,000 chance of everything being fine feels much different than hearing the word doubled. Whenever a provider gives your client a percentage, a great question to have them ask is, what is the absolute risk? Out of 1,000 people like me at this point in time in my pregnancy or my postpartum, how many people would actually experience this? And do I have additional risk factors that might change that number for me? Hopefully you already know the brain tool. The benefits, the risks, the alternatives, the intuition. What if we do nothing? But now you can be brain E. Use the brainy tool. What does high-level research evidence say? I want to add in a reminder here. Doulas, we are not medical consultants. This is a tool, but our job is not to be Dr. Google. Our job is to help our clients understand the research if they're wanting that information. Our job is to help facilitate conversations about the risk factors. And our job is to step away and let our client decide. If we personally lean toward or away from an intervention or non-intervention, or we have a really high or really low personal comfort level with certain risks, how we present the data can intentionally or unintentionally try to sway our client's decision. That has an impact on them. So here's some bias audits for you. I encourage you to pause as needed and think through the following. The first is, if a client says to you, I'm thinking about elective induction, what is the first word that pops into your head? Write it down. If a client says, fed is best, I'm not going to breastfeed, what's your internal reaction? What are you feeling? Listen to your body. Is there a hospital you hate going to? If so, is that based on a single bad experience or on current objective data about that space? Our experiences are important. They shape our worldview. They help us to make quick decisions. But sometimes what you're feeling now is not always the same as what's happening now. Next on our list is, do you ever use us versus them language? Do you ever try to guarantee your client a certain outcome? Do you go in as that protector and then feel combative towards staff? Do you ever find yourself translating what the care provider has said and filtering it through your own opinion? What if your client makes a choice that you think is wrong based on your own research or a feeling that you have? Do you feel a sense of personal frustration or a failure to meet your goal? All right, this next one is a challenge from me to you. I challenge you to break your confirmation bias loop, to challenge your beliefs, to move away from what's familiar so your brain has more to draw from. We have to expand our horizons. So to do that, choose whatever you feel might be your strongest belief about birth or postpartum, and then go on a fact-finding mission. Find yourself some studies that show the opposite. And the goal here is not to change your mind necessarily, but to prove that exceptions exist. At the very least, this will help create the mental space that you might need to support a client who chooses a different path. Lastly, here's some bias buster tips that you can stash in your doula bag. 1, lead with curiosity. Some of the best tools that we have, not conviction. Your client's goals are really the only goals that matter. 2, distinguish between efficacy and effectiveness. Just because it worked in a controlled study doesn't mean it works that way everywhere in your local hospital or your client's home in places where that study was not in place. Always provide balance to the headlines. Don't say double the risk without saying 1 in 1,000 or 2 goes to 2 in 1,000. And also acknowledge your lens. Check your biases at the door so that your client can find their own way. For a doula, a bias audit is not a one-time thing. It's a habitual checking of the instruments to ensure that they aren't unintentionally steering our client's ship. So thank you for showing up today, showing up for yourself, showing up for the people and families that you serve. If you want more tips, if you want to go deeper, if you want to get some practice having some client doula conversations around research, you can check me out at harmonydouulatraining.com. You can email me at terry@harmonydoula.com, and you can schedule a mentoring session. Have a great day.